Right, so the hominids developed in drier environments. As a group, they're recognisable by changes in their teeth and in the way they move about, upright, associated with life in bushland, probably. Upright walking suggests that hominids may have had to stand up, reach out, range for food more widely than their cousins. Humans are most closely related to the chimpanzees and bonobos, genus Pan, slightly less so to gorillas, genus Gorilla, and less still to orangutans, genus Pongo. All right. Gorillas eat fruit, leaves, such as wild ginger herbs. I'm quoting J.A.J. Gowlett, what actually was the Stone Age diet. We'll come back to those wild ginger herbs, and also bark and pith. And 3% roughly of termites and caterpillars, that's their protein. An adult male gorilla may eat more than 18 kilos of plant food per day. Now, I'll tell you my plan. Since food and civilization is our subject, I'll start by saying how humans got their food at a period when civilization hadn't begun. My definition for civilization as a historian being living together in villages, towns, cities, whatever you like. If we look for the earliest possible date for that milestone, we could find it somewhere around 10 to 12,000 years ago. We'll see whether the habits of thought as regards food that took us up to that milestone were abandoned or were still available, continue to help us perhaps, may even help us in the years to come. Because we have been civilized. So what comes next? When I mention gorillas, I'm aiming to characterize the foodways of the common ancestors of gorillas and humans and to work forward. You may think I'm going back unnecessarily far, but that's because you don't keep an eye on the Mail online, where, since last week, you can read Mark Prigg's challenging piece, Quit Atkins, Try the Gorilla Diet. And I'll summarise it for you. Well, no, in fact, I'll skip it, but I will tell you that research carried out at the University of Toronto, I'm quoting here, showed that feeding volunteers exactly the same food and quantities an ape would eat wouldn't work. Remember those 18 kilos of vegetables. So the gorilla diet actually turns out to consist of tofu bake and ratatouille and various things like that. Okay, but never mind. Into that diet should be inserted, quote from another paper, the ultimate answer to captive gorillas' heart problems, quietly growing in West Africa's vine-choked swamps. This plant, Achromomum melegueta, means different things to different people. Wild ginger herbs, it must have been, to J.A.J. Gowlett, whom I quoted, grains of paradise to craft beer brewers, who get a lovely warmth from it, and a slightly bitter flavour, which they impart to us if we're lucky enough. It means the spice trade, the medieval spice trade to historians, grains of paradise, probably crossing the Sahara before the grain coast was found and named by the explorers who were really probably aiming more at the pepper and other spices of the East. But grains of paradise are not bad, and gorillas really like them. So that's enough of gorillas, probably. Now, in addition, those are your grains of paradise. Those are the fruits in which are the seeds. But enough of gorillas. In addition to lots of fruit, such as wild figs, which are very good for them, chimpanzees eat insects and meat. They're omnivorous. They're adding in even honey and eggs to their diet. Chimpanzees hunt, generally monkeys, sometimes baby antelopes. They are the most closely related to us, and it's tempting to think that some aspects of diet go back to the common ancestor. Now then, apart from those figs, chimpanzees also take medicine for worms. You can tell that chimpanzees give a lot of thought to their digestive systems. When do they take this medicine? When they know they need to, presumably. The medicine they take is Anilema equinoctiale, which is the leaves of it, expelled in their feces along with lots of worms. you may have forgotten, but you give a lot of thought to your digestive system too, and you take medicine for worms as well. It's called martini or noyau de gras. You may not like it very much, but those intestinal worms really hate it. An all-male troop of chimpanzees may be organised to hunt for meat, while a group of females act as nurses for the young. When caught and killed, the meat is distributed to all the hunters and to others too, but not necessarily in equal quantities, because the eating of meat among chimpanzees is a thing for males in particular, whereas females might tend to go for this tasty item, the termite. So gender differences evolved apparently in the common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees, if not even earlier. Females have to gestate, lactate, carry offspring. Males have to guard territories, guard females, engender from time to time, and sit around. And that takes more meat. Now, as hominids differentiated from chimpanzees, there was a reduction in the front teeth, already 7 million years ago, apparently. This seems to indicate a diet involving heavier chewing. Can't be precise about the diet, but the suggestion is that roots and tubers were included in the diet for the first time, probably necessitated by a more seasonal environment, because roots are there even when the leaves are drying out above. And it puts starchy carbohydrates as part of our deep ancestry, as far as our diet is concerned. The suggestion is that fruit made up nearly half the early diet of hominins. Leaves were a critical item, pith, insects, flower seeds and bark were also included, and then roots came in, not used by any other primates, but only by our immediate ancestors. And then there's evidence for an increase in meat consumption, about 2 million years ago, documented by association of stone tools and bones with cut marks. Meat eating would have been more necessary in colder environments, and early humans were colonizing colder environments, Eurasia, a little after 2 million years ago. The range of plant foods was more restricted, their availability was more seasonal. They probably needed meat much more than their own ancestors in Africa and the hotter parts of Southwest Asia needed it. Direct evidence for the diet is very patchy, but bone evidence, for example, suggests that Neanderthals, our close cousins, were really carnivores, and modern humans, Homo sapiens, in Europe, supplanting Neanderthals from about 40,000 years ago, also ate a lot of meat and cooked it. They used fire, which is, of course, good for cooking roots as well. And although there's some evidence that Neanderthals used fire, certainly, but the evidence is and seems much more sporadic. So Paleolithic cave art centres very heavily on animals, not on hunts in particular, but on animals. Animals were somehow at least important to humans. And yet there's no evidence of food storage, so what do you do with something like that if you've hunted it? There's an indication there already of more cooperation, perhaps, more sharing, maybe a bit less fighting between small groups of humans. Modern hunters and gatherers, meanwhile, echo a probable variety of past diets, largely plant-based in the tropics, meat-based in the Arctic. In Paleolithic Africa and Europe, stone tools were used, and animal bones have marks on them to indicate that they were butchered. But you can't ever deduce proportions of food in the diet from the archaeological evidence as we have it, because plants could be quite a large part of the diet without leaving any signs that archaeologists from that far back have yet been able to find. Now, is it just random hunting, random gathering, random fishing? Notice that the images tend not to show hunting, as I said before, but humans involved with herds of animals in some ways. So, you'll see when I look at specific places that I happen to be showing you an article written in Latin. That's because I keep my working notes on the Latin Wikipedia, and there it is. It's a handy place, and it's really quite safe and available to anybody who can read Latin. But this, but this also shows you a map of the places that I'm going to be mentioning very briefly as examples. Clethi, rock shelter in northern Greece. In the high mountains, this is about 15 to 12,000 years ago. They watched the seasonal movements of ibex and chamois, which were already seasonal, although not yet under human control, but they were bringing those movements under human control, and they knew just where to wait to catch the ibex and chamois in the course of their migration. And in North America too, there's evidence of the direction, of directing of animal movements. Pronghorn antelope, bighorn sheep, bison, of course, from quite a long way back. A caribou driveline beneath the waters of Lake Huron, 10,000 years before, now beneath the waters, but 10,000 years before the present. So it wasn't random hunting. It wasn't just random use of wild plants either. Oh yes, well there are the ibex and the chamois. Crete. I'm taking another example from an area that I've worked in myself, though I very much am not an archaeologist. In the very early Neolithic history of Crete, which people first reached, round about 6,000 BC. In the very early Neolithic history of Crete, native oak and pine were still the main forest trees, but somehow other trees seem to have been encouraged. Wild olive, it's still wild olive, styrax, terebinth, Pistachio atlantica, relative of the pistachio. Somehow pollen analysis shows that these species were being encouraged. And the conclusion of archaeobotanists is that these changes must, to some extent, be attributed to the activities of prehistoric people. They weren't cultivating these plants, somehow they were encouraging them. There's your terebinth, or Pistachio atlantica. Archaeologists often call it pistachio, but that's the pistachio. The pistachio, by the way, this is another aspect of the use of the wild. Pistachio can be spread, and was spread to Europe and the Near East, grafted on Pistachio atlantica, grafted on terebinth. So the confusion of between terebinth and pistachio is something to avoid if possible. Some of the examples I'm going to give you are of later periods, as that one, which is after the Neolithic Revolution. But this is to make clear that farming doesn't preclude foraging and other uses of the wild. I mean, we eat bread, we pick blackberries, we gather mushrooms, or maybe snails or shellfish. The two can go together, and they need to go together. Ibex and chamois at Clythi, olive, styrax and terebinth on Crete. There's also example chestnut and horse chestnut in prehistoric Japan. Examples of the way we adjust our environment to make our work easier and our food more reliable. We make niches for ourselves, some would say. Niche construction theory. And as a species, we're really very good at it. In fact, the domestications of plants and animals that are among the markers of the beginning of civilization were not the beginning of a process. They were just one possible outcome of a much broader process, the using of the natural world in different ways. As world climates and environments stabilized about 12 to 10,000 years ago, you can see this on the screen, humans were Auditioning, now that's a nice word for it. Many wild species of plants and animals. Maybe the species of plants and animals were auditioning the humans. This is an interesting question which we needn't go into just now. But at any rate, some of these species were going to be domesticated, others were going to remain wild, and yet many of them were going to remain useful. Hunter-gatherers who do this kind of thing, they leave a relatively light footprint on the landscape. This niche construction mimics natural events, listing the possibilities, broadcast sowing of wild seeds, transplantation of fruit-bearing species so that they're nearer home, transplantation, yes, in-place encouragement of fruit-bearing species, transplantation and encouragement of root crops, landscape modification to increase the abundance of prey, guiding the animals in the way that you want them, and the fish. One or two more examples. There's a description by a Frenchman who explored Louisiana in the early 1700s, of Natchez, women and children, scattering the seeds of a plant that they called choupichoule, apparently, along the sandbanks on the lower Mississippi, newly exposed by receding floodwaters. That's the species, probably, according to Bruce Smith. I think he's right. Chenopodium berlandieri, a kind of goosefoot. Common in river valley settings in the eastern woodlands of North America, especially sandbanks exposed by floodwaters. They can grow to 6 feet in height, produce up to 50,000 small seeds. Now, there's no good archaeological markers of that kind of activity. So, although it was observed in the 18th century among people who also cultivated, because the Natchez were growers of maize, but they did this with wild plants too, no one can tell how long ago that might have begun, or how much humans may have spread that particular plant. Those eastern woodlands have a dozen or more native fruit-bearing trees, flourishing in forest edges and clearings. Elderberry, American elderberry that is, American mulberry, Morus rubra, we have that. We have it. Hackberry, sugarberry, hawthorn, American hawthorn, and plums and cherries and persimmons. Travellers such as William Bartram, who is here, describe finding these fruit trees growing around the area of abandoned settlements. And so that very strongly suggests that their growing had been encouraged in one way or another. Sometimes it can be done just by discarding seeds, and one is hardly aware that one is doing it, perhaps, but one finds eventually that it has worked. Other kinds of berry crops, not tree crops, wild strawberry, that's Fragaria virginiana, I'm going to come back to it, ground cherry, dewberry, blackberry, serviceberry, all of those, found in overgrown fields around areas of previous habitation of American Indians. Now, back to the Near East. Transplantation of fig trees has been suggested near 11,000-year-old settlements in the Jordan Valley. If it's true, it turns the fig into almost the oldest domesticated crop of the Near East. There have been arguments about that, but you do need to transplant fig trees. It's a very good idea if you have, because you want wild figs to help with the fertilization of your cultivated figs. So it's a very interesting sign that. I have wondered, but I don't know, whether the spread of ginseng has something to do with humans, because it's almost the same species. Some have thought it is the same species in Eastern Asia and in northern North America. Could some people who crossed the Bering Strait have been people who encouraged the roots of ginseng to grow and gradually carried them on with them? Who knows? I have wondered that. And there are the roots of ginseng, and One should say that about strawberries too, because the wild strawberries of North America, Virginian and Chilean, are very closely genetically related to certain wild strawberries of Japan and places north. So could they have been taken along gradually by people crossing the Bering Strait? I don't know, but I don't think it's impossible. I think the genetics needs to be looked at more, and I think it's a very interesting possibility. That on the left is the Virginian strawberry, and that on the right is the Chilean strawberry. Those two, very handily, were the parents of the hybrid that we now grow in our gardens, the garden strawberry. Well, there's also very definitely food technology going on at this early period, because lateral thinking of the kind that I've already been talking about can extend to technology, and we tend to associate that with a later stage. But the grinding of seeds, for example, at Bilancino in central Italy, at a site there, that's been seen from about 30,000 years ago. Nobody knows exactly what the seeds were being ground for, but the result would have at least have been edible. That's one of the plants involved, Brachypodium sylvaticum, which is now an invasive species in North America. Great nuisance in Oregon. And then, at the same period, about 30,000 years ago, grinding of seeds, grass seeds, but it's not known which, I don't think, at Cuddy Springs in what is now a very arid zone of New South Wales. Claimed perhaps as far back as 40,000 years ago, at least 30,000. Grinding of seeds in Israel, the site called Ohalo, which is submerged, or is sometimes submerged, under the Sea of Tiberias. 21,000 years ago, species including, what have we got there? A bromus, and another wild grass species, but many others too that I could name, including close relatives of what was eventually cultivated wheat and barley. And meanwhile, over in China, one should say that there was another kind of technology there too, because pottery, which only turns up really a little after the Neolithic Revolution in the Near East and Europe, pottery was invented long before in China, really was. And apart from that, at a site called Jiahu in the lowlands of eastern China, that pottery was being used, among other things, for the making of some kind of beer by about 9,000 years before the present. There was rice there, not yet cultivated rice, but probably being encouraged and probably by the management of water and fields to grow in the way that rice likes to grow. And the beer contained rice, wild grapes, probably Vitis hainiana, which is the wild grape of that area now, a kind of hawthorn, and honey. And if you were in Philadelphia around about 2010, you probably tasted it. It was called Chateau Jiahu and was reconstructed. Though how close the reconstruction was, I'm not sure, and how good the taste was, I'm not sure either. Now to domestication. And the first domesticated species stepped forward, Canis familiaris. Notice the lateral thinking here, because he is useful in more than one way. He will help you hunt, and you can also eat him. And notice the lateral thinking with what may have been the second domesticated species. It's hard to be sure, but probably the gourd, which you can use to carry things around and you can also eat. I say again, lateral thinking. Domesticated perhaps in Africa, spread very early to Asia, then to America, possibly from Asia, but more likely seeded across the Atlantic to South America. So this domestication went on happening under the pressure of population and climate, which brought, and this lateral thinking brought progressively greater amounts of fish, crabs, water turtles, mollusks, snails, partridges, waterfowl, wild cereal grains, more and more of those into the diet because there was a need. Population was growing, the climate was uncertain. Does that sound familiar? And the development of storage facilities was no doubt encouraged by this kind of demand too. Subterranean pits, some of them plastered, evidently for storage. So the new foods that were tended to be added to the diet are those that could easily have been collected by women and children while the men went on hunting, if that happened to amuse them. There's an emphasis too, perhaps, on borderlands, that is, on using a little more territory. Because, well, fairly naturally, if you see that a certain plant, a wheat or a barley perhaps, flourishes in the easy areas, you can begin to ask yourself, could I manage to encourage it in the rougher borderlands? And perhaps you can if you experiment. So, how am I doing for time? I've no idea how much time I've got or when I started. Am I doing all right at the moment?
You've got about 15, 20 minutes.
All right, fine. At about 9,500 to 7,500 before the present, for example, at this site Ali Kush in, I can't remember now, yes, I think it's just over the border in Iran, but it's very close to the Iraqi border. Hunting and wild plants at that period were not at first, so the archaeologists say, supplements to the diet. They were a major part of it. Some of it, wild animal meat, aurochs, pistachios, they probably mean terebinth, small wild legumes, are richer in calories or protein or both than the early farmed food. But the farmed cereals, I'm showing you club wheat, close to emmer, and wild barley, the farmed cereals grew more densely and produced more by weight than any other food source. So the various food combinations, meat, grasses, legumes, nut meats, mussels, whatnot, resulted in better nutrition probably than specialization would have done. Highest on the list of calorie-producing foods, almonds and those terebinths again. Cereal, grasses, wild legumes. Minerals came from mussels, water turtles. We have some mussels. A decent vitamin C source would have been jujube, perhaps, and also capers. Yes, that's a ripe caper fruit at the bottom there. And growing shoots of wild legumes as well. People who ate this kind of diet could possibly have been better nourished than the people who live in that area now. But one effect of cultivation, notice this, is diminution of native plant cover. So that can eventually prevent going back. I did ask myself when I began to work on this, can you go back to the foraging? You can't altogether go back because you've destroyed the basis of it to some extent by laying out fields and starting the cultivation. But although this may reduce the options, we can't stop the foraging, we can't stop the lateral thinking, and we don't. I've given you examples of the use of wild foraged foods alongside cultivated ones, and I could mention activities of that kind that have gone on more recently, which I would still class as lateral thinking. And that includes, for example, the program of crop improvement in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries. The food system lacked diversity. Very few of the crops grown in the United States are native. At that time, it wasn't evident what crops from abroad would do well. So it's a matter of experiment, it always is. And the young United States government set out to expand and diversify agriculture. The Navy collected seeds, diplomats brought back crops, expeditions looked for plants with disease-resistant traits. There were seed exchange agreements, international. One program introduced 600 new apple varieties, 700 new types of pears. There was research to develop new varieties through plant breeding, which yielded many of the modern varieties now grown, such as that old standby, the Red Delicious and Golden Delicious apples. They came out of programs like that. The Golden Delicious itself is more recent. It may not be the best apple, but it is, in certain circumstances, a very reliable apple. Practically all of my other apples have failed this year, but that one Golden Delicious that my predecessor planted, probably it was new in France at that time, that one Golden Delicious gave me a big crop. It won't make good cider though, I'm sorry about that. 20th century Britain had a smaller programme of crop development in that way, some of which has gone to ruin now. So we do continue with niche construction. We never stop. And we certainly can't stop now. So I'm going to give you a quote here. It's a bit wordy, but increasing. Where are we now? I've gone a little too far ahead there. One. Oh, I've got the pages out of order. You must forgive me for that. That's it. Yes, notice some of these quotes that I'm giving you, because here are some reflections on the significance of all this and the context of it. As long as climatic disturbances did not lead to a collapse of the underlying resource base, there you are, hunter-gatherers, that text is telling you, went on learning, went on finding things out, went on finding new wild foods to use. When disasters strike, and we're given some options here for what foragers can do: increase mobility, stay put and defend, actively intensify the yield of available resources using borderlands and so on, and using technological improvements. Okay, because the impacts of droughts, harsh winters, flooding, failing harvests, famines, wars, spreads of disease, disturbances of the social order. Does this seem familiar, some of it again? Are reasonably well documented. Some societies could cope, others collapsed. The challenge for archaeologists, and I would add for historians, and planners too, is to find how humans handled a situation and either succeeded or failed in coping with the impacts. Because, viewed dispassionately, here's another quote for you, to people who are perhaps thinking about the present while they're writing about the past: increasing food production does not appear to be an effective strategy for achieving stability in the world's farming populations. Whether farming will provide a stable solution to human subsistence, it is too early to say. Yes, exactly. Now then, we could list one or two collapses of civilizations that have taken place in the past. I think this could be of interest, no details, but think about the later Roman Empire, at least a near collapse, and quite largely brought on perhaps by mismanagement, and quite largely brought on by massive migration from the east and north. The collapse of Sabia or Sheba in the 5th century, I think, AD, which was, that's in southern Yemen, brought about simply by the destruction of a dam. That's quite a small example, but an interesting one. Collapses in America after Columbus. One could think particularly of the Amazon, where there was civilization and cultivation of crops before the European invasion, as described by the earliest European travellers, and where there is now none, so that it's possible for archaeologists who take at the moment the minority view to say it was never there. But I think there is some evidence that it was. Plenty of evidence that it was. But the rest of America too, there was a kind of collapse gradually in civilization with the European invasions, and of course disease, as well as, let's say, the barbarism of invasions had quite a lot to do with it. More recently, Scottish Highlands, 19th century Ireland, Central Asia after at the end of the Soviet period, and after Ethiopia very recently. All of these are collapses, not quite worldwide. Two authors, yes, I showed you those two authors with an eye on the present. So let's just look at what we're facing at the moment. World population, the rise, of course, fairly frightening. That's a graph showing a millennium, 1050 to 2050. Okay, and the growth rate of world population, the growth rate is in red, so it's declining. But that still means that the population is rising. It's not declining that much. So I think we have some worries there. As far as those of the population who are farmers, there are 1.3 billion people living on subsistence farms today, according to Carrie Fowler there, and he's probably roughly right. How will they adapt to climate change, he asks, and we could also ask how many of them will still be on subsistence farms in the near future, because those people living on subsistence farms are moving to the cities. And we're, as it were, still telling them to. Looking on us as the providers of televisions and phones and so on, we're telling them to move to the cities. Life in cities may be risky, but so is their life now. Life in cities offers promises, their life now perhaps doesn't. You see, we want the world, don't we? We want to taste the world with our money, with or without travelling. We want to go on having fish and meat and coffee and chocolate that other people are dying to sell to us. We've destroyed, I say we, humans, have destroyed a tenth of Earth's wilderness in the last 25 years. The Amazon accounted for nearly a third of that. It looks rather red, doesn't it? That's recently disappeared wilderness. There are other very worrying blobs of red there, New Guinea, for example, or West Irian. 14% in Central Africa. It's disastrous for endangered species, it's disastrous for climate, because tropical forests store so much of carbon. We probably have 1 or 2 decades to turn this around, said James Watson. I'm going to quote some words by scientists who have been looking into the changes that are going on at the moment, and some of the things they say may seem to you not pessimistic enough. They certainly seem so to me. But that is not to blame the scientists. It's normally because they have been looking at a particular area, and that's how it seems to them. And it's also, you'll find, because they are asked by their employers or the funds, or they are asked by the journalists, so what do we do then? And what can they do but make a suggestion? You'll see some of those suggestions in the last few minutes. Yes, I'm going to go to... you see, what I've been describing so far increases conflict among human populations. And there's another thing that increases conflict among human populations too. Obviously, drought does, because it drives people away from their homes if a drought continues long enough, and it may drive them to rebellion or certainly to migration, but also people behave badly when it's hot. There has been research on this. And the problem becomes much more difficult, said Marshall Burke, who is one of those who did the research, if it's a physiological question. You might say, he says, we could just invest in air conditioning. And he didn't mean to make you laugh by saying that, but I think we can see that in the broader scheme of things, investing in air conditioning may not be altogether a good idea. And he goes on, even in the US, where we have lots of air conditioning, you still see the strong relationship between temperature and conflict. So conflict kills food producers, destroys infrastructure, makes land unusable. It leads in itself to disruption of farming and to migration. And just to comfort you, 244 million people at the moment are international migrants. 65.5 million are displaced people or refugees, roughly, plus 10 million who are stateless. And how many people are internal migrants, born in the country, born on subsistence farms, and now living in the towns? Nobody knows, I don't think. I haven't seen any figures for that. Reduction and breakdown of small-scale and subsistence farming, greater demand for food to be brought to cities, collapse of food cultures. Yes, think about that, because that matters too. Because if you're living off handouts, you eat what they give you when they give it to you. You don't eat in a healthy environment, and you don't pass on your food culture. All this and all the rest that I've talked about so far, of course, drives climate change. Last month, hottest day, August on record, you know that. Worldwide, that is, according to NASA. July and August were the hottest months ever, as far as records take it. August was 0.16 degrees centigrade, isn't that tiny, above August 2014, the previous record holder. It was the 11th record-setting month in a row, to 2015, the warmest year on record, beating the previous mark by 0.1 degrees centigrade. Not much, but it said also that there was a 75% annual increase in the amount of land that experienced severe drought. 2015 had the highest global sea level on record. Well, I don't need to worry you with all these things because you know them. The Arctic's lowest maximum sea ice extent, recorded in February 2015, and the upper few metres of ocean have warmed regularly, decade by decade, since the start of the 20th century because the ocean is absorbing most of that heat. That's fine, but warming ocean, well, you know what that does to fish. And reduction of the acidification of the ocean as well. All of it very bad for fish. And we know that fish stocks are declining. We know we're going all over the world to find more fish stocks that we can use up in the same way as we've used some of our own. And we know the diseases that can spread in fish and in fish farms too. And from fish farms back to the oceans as a result of all of this. Okay, it's easy. I haven't begun to talk about the effect on land. Drought killing a year's crops successively so that people have to move. Northern and Eastern Africa, in particular, terrible. Southwest Asia, Central Asia, parts of the United States. Here, you could make a list of the foods to enjoy now that you won't taste anymore very soon. Corn or maize, and of course the animals that eat it as well. The corn will die soon, said Michael Caine on that film Interstellar that I happened to be watching 2 nights ago. And Michael Caine was right. And coffee. By 2080, scientists think that wild coffee, some at least, think that wild coffee will be extinct. Notice that, the extinction of the wild species. Quite likely, and others that we use in the same way perhaps too. So, yes. I wanted another... It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So, if global temperature is going to rise well beyond 2 degrees centigrade, because it surely is, because the promises made at Paris don't keep it down even, and the promises made at Paris won't necessarily be kept. So the strategy, according to some, according to climate scientists, has to be, because what else is there, to overshoot the target by as little as possible, the most realistic strategy, and then, once carbon emissions have been brought to zero, carbon dioxide could be extracted from the atmosphere. It could do the trick. The trouble is that you'd need to cover so much land with plants for combustion you wouldn't have enough space to grow food, let alone conserve wildlife. In the end, the man I'm citing, Peter Waddams of Cambridge, and I take him very seriously. In the end, he says, I think we just have to hope that some kind of extraction technology as yet unimagined by scientists is developed in the next couple of decades. If not, we're in real trouble. And I think maybe the next couple of decades is being optimistic anyway. So, crops are going to be facing new combinations of conditions for which there's no historical experience. Now, this is Carrie Fowler speaking again, whom I showed you before. They'll require new combinations of traits that can only be developed, he says, by preserving genetic diversity and proactively breeding new varieties. I'm sure that's true. He's called, I wish he would spread out a bit, I'm sorry about that. He's called for governments to preserve the diversity of crops grown by farmers in another mass adaptation experiment like the United States one of the late 18th and 19th centuries. I know that sounds like a wild and crazy idea, he says, but I haven't heard any alternatives to it, and he has made it possible to put it into practice by building the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. There it is, built into the side of a mountain in Spitsbergen because the ideal temperature for storing seeds is minus 18 degrees Celsius. Inside the frozen walls of that vault, shelves full of boxes holding duplicate seeds from seed banks around the world. The vault now houses seeds from over 864,000 varieties of plants. There is no better solution that I can see. But how far ahead this resource will be called on, what climate will prevail at that time, and even which species will be carrying out the crop research, I don't feel quite sure. Thank you. And I said to myself, what do I think is it important to say?
And you said
I thought that was quite
you're all
important.
terrified here. What do you actually think? What do you think?
I actually am pessimistic. I don't think that we have the capability to make the changes that we need to make. I don't know even whether we want to have that capability, because really one of the most important things we have to do somehow is to reduce our population. And do we want to do that? We didn't like it when China, for example, actually did take steps to reduce its population. Do we want to do that? But if we don't do that, then we have very little possibility of reducing climate change. And again, we want to stop, I know we want to suggest to people that life in cities spending lots of money on getting food from all over the world and all the other things that we all want from all over the world will not in the long term be a good thing. But although we know that, can we persuade everybody of that? And can we take the steps that would help to persuade? I don't know that we can.
The great archaeologist, anthropologist Ronald Wright, who wrote that wonderful history of what happened to the America's stolen continents, wrote a very short book called A Short History of Progress, in which he points out that civilizations in the past that have collapsed, as they all have been localized. Mm. There was always somebody else waiting in the wings somewhere to take over. This time, our civilization is global. Mm-hmm. There is no little corner someplace to pick up the pieces. If there are any pieces, it's our last chance.
Mm-hmm. He's pessimistic too. Are you pessimistic?
Yes. I wrote a review of his book, which he likes very much, in which I carry the pessimism even further.
I'd like to. I haven't read the book, and I'd like to read the review as well.
Question?
Okay, right. First of all, China used a very patriarchal system for reducing the breeding program,
Yes.
so that it ended up with far more males than females, which has caused most of the problems in China. So that's a completely different issue which needs to be addressed. I think on an entire symposium.
I wasn't recommending necessarily.
No. But most of the problems relate to the fact that they aborted female fetuses, which is what's happening in other parts of the world, like India as well. Secondly, I disagree. I'm very optimistic towards the future because there's a lot of work being done. I have an allotment, for example, and I have what are called Hugelbett cultures, which are basically tree trunk based and large high mounds which can be up to 6 feet high, and in America, where they're really embracing this in drought-ridden areas, these mounds are absolutely massive. They're putting them together with the aid of large-scale machines. The thing about a Hugelbett is that as the tree trunks decay, you have two positives. The first is that they become sponge-like, and that holds water, so that during periods of drought, your plant roots are going down into the water and are being fed, even though the environment around is dry. And secondly, the decay is creating nutrient supplies, so that you're having a massive amount of nutrients without having to add added fertilizers and so on and so forth. Now, my Hugelbett are in the 3rd year, and this year have produced large amounts of crops, and I'm expecting an even better one. This is, if you like, what is it? It's a practice. I'm just experimenting with this.
Yes.
You also have.
May I sort of interrupt you at that point, because I think that kind of experiment goes beyond an experiment to producing good results that you can certainly continue with.
Absolutely.
That kind of experiment is what we need to do more and more of.
Yes.
My pessimism comes from the doubt whether it will be enough, but I think it's still very important for us. And I too experiment with plants, with fruit growing in particular, trying to see what works and what will continue to work, and what may work better if the climate changes in the direction that it seems to be changing.
Well, we also have other issues in that we're now experimenting with things like vertical gardens, which some French guy created, and Dubai is really taken this on board, for example. Now, a vertical garden is obviously going to, because the plants aspirate, and they aspirate water as well as oxygen. This means that the climate around the cities that are dealing with vertical gardens will actually change to create a more humid environment, which if you then add in things like the London Bridge garden that's going to come in, and roof gardens and so on, as well as returning to the cottage garden of domestic houses and so on, these are more the way forward.
Yes, the roof gardens are very good, and bees seem to like roof gardens too, which is something in their favour.
Have you got 2 more questions? If I could move on,
yes,
and you could carry on. First John and then Sammy. Yeah, John.
It's sort of a question, also a comment. I think you may be conflating 2 different types of collapse, one of those being the collapse of food production systems, and one being the collapse of, kind of political, quote-unquote, civilization. I mean, if you take the example, for instance, of, say, the Mayans, you have classic Mayan civilization, quote-unquote, collapse. It didn't actually mean that things got worse for the Mayans. What it meant was the political elites collapsed, the food production was going great, and actually the common person may have been better off, because you have a very high correlation between between essentially intensive food production and political inequality. And when you mentioned about the people in somewhere between Iran and Iraq, possibly when they were kind of quasi-foragers, sort of starting to do some food production, possibly having a better diet than they have in that area today. That's kind of, I mean, that's classic, supported by all kinds of anthropological, archaeological evidence that when food production starts, you tend to have a decline in the health and well-being of people because of lack of diversity in diet and also extraction of food resources and other wealth by political elites.
It's a
and
trade-off.
So if you take it forward to the present, it would be likely that those two types of collapse would occur simultaneously, that there would be issues with the food production system as alongside collapse of other aspects of quote-unquote civilization. But on the other hand, I'm not saying that I personally hold this view, but there could be some people who would hold the view that if people who, if the small percentage of people who own 90% of the world's wealth, if they were to collapse, maybe things maybe that wouldn't be a horrible thing.
Yes,
maybe it would mean that there's more food and more wealth for other people.
Yes, but there are so many other people and an increasing number of them. So yes, the trade-off that happened as crop domestication began, as cultivation took hold, the trade-off was less probably health, a less healthy diet, but feeding many more people. We still have to feed many more people, but yes, those are interesting points. I agree that political collapse doesn't necessarily entail the collapse of a food system. That's quite true.
Yes, a history of pessimism. The Reverend Malthus, a long time ago, maybe started it or was just continuing the earlier ones. And there have been constant waves of pessimism along the same lines, population and resources, at every stage, and we were led to think of collapse. And somehow we have managed to survive and even prosper. And I'm just wondering, I have no solutions. You can see all the problems which you are posing, Andrew. But at the same time, somehow looking at this history of pessimism, I wonder whether there aren't any solutions like the lady that was putting forward.
Yes, there are solutions, and oddly enough, I wasn't anywhere near so pessimistic until I began to work on this paper. So thank you very much. But yes, I have been led gradually to a more pessimistic view because of the size of the problems that are facing us and that are pressing on us rather fast. But I think we have to keep on doing what we can.
And the moral of it, don't read.
I used to be uncertain, but now I'm not so sure.
Very good.
Yes, okay, I think we'll break for coffee now. And thank you very much, Edwin. That was very helpful.